The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan village as Maria Santos adjusted her medical bag one final time. She had been working as a civilian nurse with the humanitarian aid organization for 8 months now, treating locals who had nowhere else to turn. The villagers had grown to trust her gentle hands and warm smile, despite the language barrier that often stood between them. Maria never imagined her life would take this path. Back in Texas, she had worked in a comfortable hospital, treating patients who arrived in ambulances rather than on foot after walking for days. But something inside her had called for more purpose, more meaning. When the opportunity came to serve in Afghanistan, her family begged her not to go. Her mother cried for weeks and her father threatened to disown her. But Maria felt a pull stronger than their fears. The village clinic was nothing like the sterile hospitals back home. It was a small building with cracked walls and limited supplies, but it served as a beacon of hope for hundreds of people. Maria worked alongside Dr. Ahmad, a local physician who had dedicated his life to serving his community despite the constant dangers surrounding them. Together, they had saved countless lives and brought healing to a place that knew too much suffering. On this particular morning, Maria noticed something different in the air. The usual sounds of children playing and vendors calling out their wares were absent. Even the dogs that normally roamed the streets seemed to have disappeared. Dr. Ahmad appeared more nervous than usual, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the hills that surrounded their village. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble that grew steadily louder. Maria looked up from the child she was treating to see dust clouds rising on the horizon. Dr. Ahmad grabbed her arm and spoke in urgent, broken English about the need to leave immediately. But Maria looked around at the patients waiting for care. An elderly man with infected wounds, a pregnant woman in distress, children with fevers that had lasted for days. She shook her head and continued working. These people needed her, and she would not abandon them because of some distant threat that might never materialize. Dr. Ahmad pleaded with her, explaining that insurgent forces were moving toward the village and that foreign aid workers were always primary targets. Still, Maria refused to leave. The rumbling grew closer, and soon they could hear the distinct sound of vehicles approaching. Dr. Ahmad made a difficult decision. He would stay with Maria, knowing that his presence might offer her some protection as a local. Together, they moved their most vulnerable patients to the back room of the clinic, hoping the thick walls might shield them from whatever was coming. The first explosion shattered the morning calm like thunder from a clear sky. The clinic's windows blew inward, sending glass fragments across the room. Maria threw herself over a small girl she had been treating, feeling the sharp pieces cut into her back and arms. The child's terrified screams mixed with the sounds of chaos erupting outside. More explosions followed, each one closer than the last. Through the broken windows, Maria could see armed men moving through the village streets. They were systematic and ruthless, going from house to house. The sound of gunfire echoed off the surrounding hills, creating a symphony of terror that seemed to come from every direction. Dr. Ahmad whispered prayers in his native language while Maria tried to keep the patients calm. She sang soft lullabies to the children, the same ones her grandmother had sung to her years ago in Texas. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to appear strong for those who depended on her. The clinic door burst open with a crash that made everyone inside jump. 3 armed men entered, their faces covered and their weapons ready. They shouted in a language Maria did not understand, but their intentions were clear. Dr. Ahmad stepped forward, trying to explain in multiple languages that this was a medical facility treating innocent people. One of the men struck Dr. Ahmad across the face with the butt of his rifle, sending the doctor crashing to the floor. Blood streamed from a gash above his eye as he struggled to stay conscious. Maria moved instinctively to help him, but another gunman grabbed her arm roughly, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. They demanded to know her nationality, her purpose, and who had sent her. Maria answered honestly, explaining that she was an American nurse providing medical care to anyone who needed it. This seemed to anger them further. They spoke rapidly among themselves, occasionally pointing at her and then at the patients cowering in the corner. The leader of the group made a decision that would change everything. He ordered his men to gather all the medical supplies and destroy the clinic. Maria watched in horror as they began smashing equipment and pouring fuel over everything they could not carry. Years of Dr. Ahmad's work, countless medical supplies that had taken months to obtain, and the only source of health care for miles around. All of it was about to be destroyed. As the smell of gasoline filled the air, Maria realized they intended to burn the clinic with everyone inside. The patients, mostly women and children, huddled together in terror. Dr. Ahmad, though injured, tried once more to negotiate for their release. But the gunmen had made their decision, and nothing would change their minds. In that moment, Maria made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She stepped forward and offered herself in exchange for the others. She told them they could take her, but they must let the patients and Dr. Ahmad leave safely. The leader studied her face for what felt like an eternity, perhaps seeing something in her eyes that surprised him. The negotiation was brief and brutal. They would take her, but the others would only be spared if she cooperated completely. Maria nodded her agreement, knowing that her life was now in their hands. As they prepared to leave, she looked back at Dr. Ahmad and the frightened faces of the people she had come to serve. She wondered if she would ever see any of them again, or if this dusty clinic would be the last place she would ever know as home. The journey to the insurgent camp took 3 days through terrain that seemed designed to break both spirit and body. Maria's hands were bound tightly behind her back with rough rope that cut into her wrists with every bump and jolt of the old truck. Her captors spoke little, communicating mostly through harsh gestures and occasional shouts when she moved too slowly for their liking. The truck bed where they forced her to sit was metal and unforgiving. Under the scorching Afghan sun, it became hot enough to burn exposed skin. Maria tried to shift positions to avoid the worst of the heat, but the restraints made any movement painful and limited. Her medical training told her she was becoming dehydrated, but her captors showed no interest in her physical condition. On the second day, they stopped at a remote compound hidden among rocky hills that provided natural concealment from aircraft. The place looked like it had been carved directly from the mountainside, with buildings that blended so well with the landscape that they were nearly invisible from a distance. This was clearly a well-established operation, not some temporary hideout. Maria was dragged from the truck and pushed into a small concrete room with no windows and only a heavy metal door. The space was barely large enough for her to lie down, with walls that wept moisture and a floor covered in dirt and debris. A bucket in the corner served as her only facility, and the smell suggested she was not the first person to be held in this particular cell. The isolation was immediate and crushing. For someone accustomed to constant interaction with patients and colleagues, the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She could hear voices and movement outside, but the thick walls muffled everything into an indistinct murmur that provided no clues about her fate or the activities of her captors. Food came irregularly, sometimes a bowl of thin soup and stale bread once a day, sometimes nothing for what felt like days at a time. Maria quickly learned to eat everything they gave her, no matter how unappetizing, because she never knew when the next meal might come. Her body began to adapt to the constant hunger, but the mental challenge of not knowing what each day would bring proved far more difficult. The interrogations began after her first week in captivity. They came at random times, sometimes in the middle of what she assumed was night, sometimes during the heat of the day. Her captors wanted information about American military operations, aid organization activities, and the locations of other foreign workers. Maria told them truthfully that she knew nothing about military matters, and that her work focused solely on medical care. They did not believe her. The questioning sessions grew longer and more intense. Sometimes they would deprive her of sleep for days, bringing her to a room where bright lights prevented any rest while voices demanded answers she did not have. Other times they would leave her in complete darkness for so long that she began to lose track of time entirely. The worst part was not the physical discomfort, though that was considerable. It was the psychological warfare they waged against her mind. They would tell her that her government had forgotten about her, that no one was looking for her, and that she would spend the rest of her life in this hole. They showed her fake news reports claiming she had been declared dead, and that her family had already held her funeral. Maria fought to maintain her sanity by creating routines in her tiny cell. She would exercise as much as the space allowed, doing push-ups and stretches to keep her body functioning. She recited every song, poem, and prayer she could remember, sometimes speaking them aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was her own. She thought about her patients back at the clinic, wondering if Dr. Ahmad had been able to continue providing care without her supplies and assistance. Medical knowledge became both a blessing and a curse during her captivity. She could diagnose her own deteriorating condition, the weight loss, the muscle atrophy, the effects of malnutrition and dehydration. But she also knew enough to understand how to maximize her chances of survival. She rationed her energy carefully and tried to maintain her mental focus through meditation techniques she had learned during nursing school. The guards seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. They would bang on the metal door at random times to startle her awake, or slide her food through a slot with just enough force to spill half of it on the dirty floor. Some of them spoke broken English and would taunt her with descriptions of what they planned to do with her if she continued to refuse cooperation. As weeks turned into months, Maria began to notice changes in the camp routine. There were more frequent meetings among the leadership, more weapons being moved around, and a general sense of increased activity. She could not understand the languages being spoken, but the tone and urgency suggested that something significant was being planned. One night, she was awakened by the sound of vehicles arriving and departing. Through the small gap under her door, she could see unusual amounts of light and activity. Guards were moving with more purpose than usual, and she could hear equipment being loaded and unloaded. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than the routine operations she had observed during her captivity. The next morning brought a change she had not expected. Instead of the usual guard who brought her meager breakfast, the door opened to reveal one of the camp leaders she had seen during interrogations. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her weakened condition and the way months of captivity had changed her appearance. He spoke to her in careful English, explaining that her situation was about to change dramatically. The organization had decided she could be useful for purposes beyond information gathering. They planned to move her to a different location where she would serve as a medic for their fighters. If she refused or attempted to escape, they would execute her immediately. Maria realized this might be her only chance to survive. Working as a medic would give her more freedom of movement and possibly opportunities to escape that she would never have locked in a cell. She agreed to cooperate, knowing that keeping insurgent fighters alive went against everything she believed in, but understanding that her immediate survival depended on this compromise. That the leader seemed pleased by her acceptance and warned her that any attempt at sabotage or escape would result in consequences worse than death. He described in detail what they would do to her if she betrayed their trust, and Maria understood that these were not empty threats. She had seen enough during her captivity to know that these men were capable of extreme cruelty. As they prepared to move her to the new location, Maria caught her reflection in a piece of broken glass and barely recognized herself. Months of malnutrition and stress had changed her dramatically. But somewhere behind the hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, she could still see the nurse who had refused to abandon her patients when the attack began. That person was still there, and she would need every bit of that strength for whatever came next. The new location turned out to be a network of caves carved into a mountainside, connected by narrow passages that created a maze-like complex. Maria quickly understood why they had chosen this place. It was virtually invisible from the air, and could house dozens of fighters while remaining completely hidden from outside observation. The caves stayed cool during the hot days and retained warmth during the cold nights, making them naturally suited for long-term occupation. Her new role as the camp medic brought both opportunities and moral challenges she had never imagined facing. The fighters who sought her care were the same men who had terrorized innocent villages and taken her captive. Yet when they came to her bleeding and broken, she saw only patients who needed medical attention. Her training had taught her to heal without judgment, but these circumstances tested that principle in ways no textbook could have prepared her for. The medical supplies available were basic and often improvised. She worked with whatever materials the fighters could scavenge or steal from aid convoys and military operations. Bandages made from torn clothing, antiseptic solutions mixed from questionable ingredients, and surgical tools that had seen better days became her daily reality. Despite the limitations, she found ways to provide effective care by drawing on techniques she had learned working in resource-poor environments. Maria quickly established a makeshift clinic in one of the larger caves. She organized supplies with military precision, creating systems that maximized efficiency despite the chaotic nature of her surroundings. The fighters initially viewed her with suspicion, but as word spread about her skill and dedication, even the most hardened among them began to treat her with a grudging respect. The work was demanding and never-ending. Fighters returned from operations with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and infections that threatened to turn deadly without proper treatment. Maria worked by lamplight and candlelight, often for hours at a time, using techniques that combined modern medical knowledge with improvised field medicine. She learned to perform procedures she had only read about, adapting to conditions that would have been unthinkable in a traditional hospital setting. What surprised her most was how the fighters began to open up to her during treatment. Pain and vulnerability had a way of breaking down barriers, and men who projected ruthless strength in public would sometimes reveal glimpses of their humanity when they thought no one else was listening. Some spoke of families they missed, others of regrets about the path their lives had taken. Maria listened without judgment, understanding that these moments of connection might be her only window into understanding her captors as human beings rather than faceless enemies. One fighter named Hassan became a regular patient due to a chronic condition that required ongoing care. During their sessions, he would practice his English while she worked, and gradually their conversations became less guarded. Hassan had been a teacher before the war changed everything, and he still carried a worn photograph of his students in his pocket. Through him, Maria began to understand the complex motivations that drove these men, even as she continued to disagree with their methods. The camp operated on a strict hierarchy, and Maria learned to navigate the political dynamics that determined everything from food distribution to work assignments. The leader, known only as Commander Aziz, maintained absolute authority through a combination of charisma and fear. He was intelligent and well-educated, speaking multiple languages fluently, and demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of military tactics and psychological warfare. Commander Aziz took a particular interest in Maria's work, visiting the clinic regularly to check on her progress and the condition of his fighters. These interactions were always tense, as Maria never knew whether he was genuinely concerned about her welfare or looking for reasons to punish her. He seemed to appreciate her medical skills while remaining suspicious of her ultimate loyalties. As months passed, Maria began to notice patterns in the camp's operations that suggested they were planning something significant. Weapons shipments arrived more frequently, and new fighters joined the group regularly. Training exercises became more intense and specialized, focusing on urban warfare tactics and coordination between different units. The atmosphere grew more charged with anticipation and nervous energy. Her position as the camp medic gave her access to information that ordinary prisoners would never see. She overheard conversations about targets, timelines, and logistical challenges that revealed the scope of their planning. While she could not understand all the technical details, it became clear that they were preparing for a major operation that would involve significant casualties on both sides. The moral weight of her situation became increasingly difficult to bear. Every fighter she healed would return to operations that endangered innocent civilians and coalition forces. Yet she also knew that refusing to provide care would mean certain death, not just for herself, but potentially for other captives who might depend on her cooperation for their survival. She walked a tightrope between maintaining her medical ethics and surviving in an environment where compassion could be seen as weakness. Maria began to develop escape plans. During the quiet hours when most of the camp slept, she studied the cave system, noting which passages led to exits and which ones ended in dead ends. She observed guard rotations and identified the times when security was most relaxed. But the challenges were enormous. She was weak from months of poor nutrition, unfamiliar with the surrounding terrain, and had no idea how far she would need to travel to reach safety. The breakthrough came when Hassan mentioned during one of their sessions that he had been tasked with scouting potential routes to the main road. His casual comment about landmarks and travel times gave Maria crucial information about the geography surrounding their hidden camp. She began to piece together a mental map of the area, calculating distances and identifying potential shelter points along possible escape routes. Her planning was interrupted by news that changed everything. Commander Aziz announced that the camp would be moving to a new location within the week. The operation they had been preparing for was about to begin, and this cave system was too close to areas that would see increased military activity. Maria realized that this move might represent her last realistic chance to escape before becoming even more deeply embedded in their operations. The announcement created a flurry of activity as fighters began packing equipment and preparing for the relocation. In the chaos, Maria saw opportunities that had not existed during the camp's normal routine. Guards were distracted by packing duties, and the usual strict supervision was replaced by a more relaxed atmosphere focused on logistics rather than security. She began to gather supplies for her escape attempt. Medical supplies that could serve as trade goods, water purification tablets, and small items that might prove useful during a journey through hostile territory. Everything had to be collected and hidden without arousing suspicion, requiring careful timing and considerable nerve. As the departure date approached, Maria made her final preparations while continuing to provide medical care to fighters who had no idea she was planning to disappear. The irony was not lost on her that she was healing men who would soon be hunting her through the mountains if her escape attempt was discovered. But she had learned to live with such contradictions during her months in captivity, and now all that mattered was finding a way back to freedom. The escape began during the pre-dawn hours when the camp was at its quietest. Maria had volunteered for the night shift in the medical tent, claiming that several patients needed monitoring through the night. This gave her a legitimate reason to be awake and moving around while most of the fighters slept. She had spent days studying the guard rotations and identified a 30-minute window when the sentries changed positions, creating a gap in their surveillance of the eastern ridge. Her heart pounded as she gathered the supplies she had carefully hidden over the past week. Water bottles, medical supplies, dried food she had saved from her rations, and a knife she had stolen from the kitchen were distributed among hidden pockets in her clothing. Everything had to be small enough to remain undetectable if she encountered guards during her initial movement away from the camp. The cave system worked in her favor, as the numerous passages and exits meant that no single guard could monitor all possible routes. Maria had memorized the path to a secondary exit that was used primarily for waste disposal and rarely watched during the night hours. The passage was narrow and uncomfortable, but it emerged on a ledge that provided access to a steep trail down the mountainside. Moving through the caves required extreme caution. Every footstep seemed to echo in the darkness, and Maria had to feel her way along the walls to avoid making noise that might alert the guards. The smell of unwashed bodies and cooking fires gradually faded as she moved deeper into the unused sections of the cave system, replaced by the cooler, cleaner air that suggested proximity to an outside exit. The emergence into the night air felt like a rebirth. After months of breathing the stale atmosphere of caves and cells, the mountain air filled her lungs with a freshness that was almost intoxicating. Stars filled the sky above her, providing just enough light to navigate by while keeping her movements hidden from casual observation. The temperature was cold but manageable, and Maria pulled her stolen jacket tighter as she began her descent. The trail down the mountainside was treacherous, especially in the darkness. Loose rocks threatened to send her tumbling down steep slopes, and more than once she had to grab onto scrub vegetation to prevent a fall that could have ended her escape before it truly began. Her months of poor nutrition had left her weaker than she had been before captivity, and the physical demands of the descent quickly began to take their toll. By dawn, Maria had put several miles between herself and the camp, but she knew the real danger was just beginning. As soon as her absence was discovered, search parties would be organized and dispatched in all directions. Her best hope was to reach the main road before they could establish a perimeter around the mountain area. But the terrain made rapid travel impossible. She found shelter in a cluster of large rocks as the sun rose, knowing that daylight movement would make her visible to aircraft and ground patrols. The hiding spot provided protection from the wind and concealment from all but the most thorough search efforts. Maria rationed herself to small sips of water and a few bites of food, knowing that her supplies had to last until she could find help or reach civilization. The sound of helicopters began around midday, confirming that her escape had been discovered. The aircraft followed search patterns that gradually expanded outward from the camp location, and Maria could hear them growing closer as the hours passed. She pressed herself deeper into her rocky shelter, knowing that even the smallest movement could give away her position to observers equipped with advanced optics. As the search intensified, Maria began to question whether her escape attempt had been realistic. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, and she had no way of knowing whether she was traveling toward safety or deeper into territory controlled by hostile forces. Her medical training helped her monitor her own condition, and she recognized the early signs of exhaustion and dehydration that could prove fatal if she pushed too hard. The second night brought new challenges as the temperature dropped below freezing. Maria had not anticipated how cold the mountains would become, and her inadequate clothing provided little protection against the biting wind. She was forced to keep moving to maintain body temperature, despite the risks of traveling in darkness over unfamiliar terrain. A twisted ankle during the third day nearly ended her escape attempt. The injury occurred when she stepped on loose rocks while trying to avoid an area where she had heard voices. The pain was immediate and severe, and Maria had to use her medical knowledge to assess whether the ankle was sprained or broken. Fortunately, it appeared to be a sprain, but the injury significantly slowed her progress and added another layer of difficulty to an already challenging situation. The voices she had heard turned out to belong to local villagers, but Maria could not determine whether they were friendly or sympathetic to her captors. She watched from concealment as they worked in terraced fields, noting their routines and trying to assess whether approaching them would lead to rescue or recapture. The language barrier would make communication difficult, and she had no way of knowing their political allegiances. On the fourth day, Maria's water ran out completely. She had tried to ration carefully, but the physical demands of mountain travel and the dry air had depleted her supplies faster than anticipated. Dehydration became a more immediate threat than recapture, and she was forced to take the risk of approaching a stream she had spotted in a valley below her position. The descent to the water source required crossing open ground, where she would be visible to aircraft and ground observers. Maria waited until late afternoon when the angle of the sun would make it more difficult to spot her from above, then moved as quickly as her injured ankle would allow. The stream water was cold and clear, and she drank deeply while refilling her containers and washing her face for the first time in days. While at the stream, Maria noticed tire tracks in the soft earth along the bank. The marks appeared fresh and suggested that vehicles used this area regularly, possibly as a crossing point for local traffic. This discovery gave her hope that she might be approaching areas with more human activity, though she remained cautious about whether that activity would prove helpful or dangerous. The sound of approaching vehicles sent Maria scrambling for cover among the rocks along the stream bank. Through gaps in her hiding place, she watched as a convoy of trucks approached the crossing point. The vehicles bore no military markings, but the armed men riding in them suggested they were not ordinary civilians. Maria held her breath as the convoy stopped at the stream to refill water containers and allow the occupants to rest. One of the men separated from the group and walked directly toward her hiding place. Maria's heart raced as she realized she had been spotted, despite her efforts at concealment. The man called out in a language she did not recognize, then switched to heavily accented English, asking her to come out where he could see her. With no other options available, Maria emerged from her hiding place with her hands visible and empty. The man studied her appearance, taking in her obvious exhaustion and the medical supplies visible in her clothing. His expression suggested surprise rather than hostility, and when he spoke again, his tone was more curious than threatening. The conversation that followed would determine whether her escape had led to freedom or simply to a different form of captivity. Maria identified herself as an American nurse who had escaped from insurgent captors, hoping that her medical skills might prove valuable enough to ensure safe passage. The man listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that suggested he was evaluating the truth of her story. What happened next surprised Maria completely. The man introduced himself as a member of a local militia group that opposed the same insurgent forces that had held her captive. They had been tracking the movements of various hostile groups in the area and were aware of the cave complex she had described. Her escape had provided them with valuable intelligence about enemy positions and activities. The militia commander, who introduced himself as Captain Mahmoud, made a decision that would change the trajectory of Maria's survival story. Instead of simply providing safe passage to the nearest coalition base, he asked her to consider staying with his unit temporarily to provide medical care for his fighters. The request was made respectfully, with assurances that she would be treated as an honored guest rather than a captive. But Maria understood the precarious nature of her situation. Captain Mahmoud explained that his militia operated with minimal outside support, relying primarily on local resources and captured supplies. They had no formal medical training among their ranks, and casualties from their operations against insurgent forces often died from treatable wounds. Maria's medical expertise could save lives and significantly improve their operational effectiveness against the same groups that had held her prisoner. The moral complexity of this new situation was not lost on Maria. Once again, she found herself in a position where providing medical care would indirectly support military operations. However, this time the forces she would be helping were actively fighting against her former captors and working to protect local civilians from insurgent violence. The decision to stay was easier than her previous compromise, though it still required her to navigate the ethical challenges of working in a conflict zone. The militia camp was a stark contrast to the insurgent caves she had escaped from. Located in a valley surrounded by friendly villages, it operated more like a traditional military outpost than a hidden terrorist cell. The fighters were local men who had taken up arms to defend their communities, and they maintained connections with their families and civilian lives. This created an atmosphere that felt more like a legitimate military operation than the shadowy existence she had known. During her captivity, Maria quickly established a medical facility using supplies the militia had captured from insurgent raids and donations from sympathetic villagers. The working conditions were still primitive compared to modern hospitals, but they were vastly superior to what she had experienced in the caves. More importantly, she was treating people who had chosen to fight for causes she could support, rather than being forced to aid her own captors. The fighters who came to her for treatment were different from the insurgents she had previously cared for. These men spoke openly about their motivations, their families, and their hopes for the future of their region. Many of them had lost relatives to insurgent violence and had joined the militia, as much for revenge as for protection. Their wounds told stories of battles fought to defend villages and escort aid convoys through dangerous territory. Word of Maria's presence spread quickly through the network of allied villages, and soon she was treating not only militia fighters but also civilians who had been injured in insurgent attacks, or who simply lacked access to medical care. Children with infections, elderly people with chronic conditions, and women with complications from childbirth all found their way to her makeshift clinic. This return to treating innocent civilians felt like a restoration of her original purpose in Afghanistan. Captain Mahmoud proved to be an intelligent and principled leader who understood the importance of maintaining local support for his operations. He encouraged Maria's civilian medical work, recognizing that it strengthened the relationship between his militia and the communities they served. This enlightened approach created an environment where Maria could practice medicine according to her ethical standards while supporting a cause she believed in. The militia's intelligence network provided regular updates on insurgent activities in the region, including searches for Maria and her former captors' efforts to track her down. Captain Mahmoud assigned personal guards to ensure her safety, but he also began incorporating her local knowledge into operational planning. Her months in the insurgent camp had given her insights into their tactics, routines, and leadership structure that proved valuable for counterinsurgency operations. As weeks passed, Maria began to feel a sense of purpose that had been missing during her captivity. The combination of medical work and contributing to operations against her former captors provided a form of psychological healing that pure escape could never have achieved. She was no longer simply surviving. She was actively working to prevent other people from experiencing the suffering she had endured. The militia's next major operation was planned as a raid on a weapons cache that insurgents were using to supply attacks against civilian targets. Intelligence indicated that the cache was located in a compound similar to the one where Maria had been held, and her knowledge of insurgent security procedures could help minimize casualties on both sides. Captain Mahmoud asked for her input on planning the raid, marking her transition from refugee to active participant in the conflict. Maria's recommendations focused on timing and approach strategies that would avoid the heaviest defensive positions while allowing for rapid extraction of captured materials. Her medical expertise also contributed to planning for treating wounded fighters and any insurgent casualties that might result from the operation. The comprehensive approach reflected the militia's commitment to professional military standards rather than simple revenge attacks. The night before the raid, Maria experienced conflicting emotions about her evolving role in the conflict. Part of her remained committed to the healing profession and its emphasis on preserving life rather than ending it. But another part of her recognized that some forms of violence were necessary to protect innocent people from greater harm. Her captivity had taught her that pure pacifism was a luxury that not everyone could afford in a world where evil existed and thrived. The raid itself was executed with precision that surprised Maria, who had assumed that militia operations would be crude compared to professional military actions. Captain Mahmoud's fighters moved with discipline and coordination that minimized unnecessary violence while achieving their objectives. The weapons cache was secured with minimal casualties, and several insurgent fighters were captured, rather than killed, demonstrating the militia's commitment to rules of engagement. Maria's role during the operation was to establish a casualty collection point where wounded fighters from both sides could receive medical attention. The experience of treating insurgent prisoners who might have been her captors only weeks earlier tested her professional ethics in ways she had never imagined. Yet she found that her medical training overcame personal feelings, allowing her to provide care based on need rather than politics or revenge. The success of the raid elevated Maria's status within the militia and the broader community of allied villages. Captain Mahmoud formally offered her a permanent position as the unit's medical officer, with assurances that she would be protected and supported in her work. The offer was tempting, as it provided security and purpose in an environment where she had found acceptance and respect. However, Maria also knew that her family back in Texas had no idea whether she was alive or dead. The humanitarian organization she had worked for had likely declared her missing and presumed dead months earlier. Her disappearance had probably caused immense suffering for people who loved her, and she felt a responsibility to let them know she had survived her ordeal. The decision about whether to stay with the militia or attempt to make contact with coalition forces became the next major challenge in Maria's journey. Captain Mahmoud understood her dilemma and offered to help facilitate communication with American forces. But he also warned her about the complexities of dealing with coalition bureaucracy and the possibility that she might be removed from the region for security reasons. As Maria weighed her options, reports arrived of increased insurgent activity in response to the successful raid. Her former captors were actively searching for the militia base, and her presence there created additional risks for the fighters who had protected her. The web of obligations and loyalties she had developed during her time with the militia made every decision more complicated than simple self-preservation. The decision to make contact with coalition forces came when intelligence reports indicated that a major insurgent offensive was being planned against the valley, where the militia had established their base. Captain Mahmoud's fighters were skilled and dedicated, but they lacked the heavy weapons and air support necessary to repel a coordinated attack by superior numbers. Maria realized that her knowledge of insurgent tactics and her status as an American citizen might be crucial in securing the support needed to protect the community that had sheltered her. Captain Mahmoud arranged for a secure communication with a coalition patrol operating in the region, using radio frequencies that his intelligence network had identified as belonging to special operations units. The initial contact was tense, as coalition forces had learned to be suspicious of unverified communications that could be insurgent attempts to gather intelligence or set traps. Maria's ability to provide specific details about her background and captivity gradually convinced the operators that her story was genuine. The response from Coalition Command was swift and overwhelming. Within hours of confirming Maria's identity, plans were set in motion for an extraction operation that would bring her back to safety while gathering the intelligence she had accumulated during her months in the field. However, Maria insisted that any rescue operation must also include protection for the militia fighters and civilians who had risked their lives to help her. The extraction team that arrived 3 days later was unlike anything Maria had expected. Instead of a simple evacuation helicopter, a full special operations unit deployed to the valley with equipment and personnel that transformed the militia's defensive capabilities overnight. The team was led by a Navy SEAL lieutenant commander who introduced himself simply as Jake, and his professionalism immediately impressed both Maria and Captain Mahmoud. Jake's briefing revealed that Maria's escape and survival had provided coalition forces with intelligence about insurgent operations that had been impossible to obtain through other means. Her detailed knowledge of cave systems, Leadership structures and planned operations had enabled successful strikes against multiple insurgent cells across the region. What she had viewed as simply surviving her captivity had actually dealt significant blows to enemy capabilities. The SEAL team's arrival coincided with the beginning of the insurgent offensive that intelligence had predicted. However, instead of facing an unprepared militia with limited weapons, the attackers encountered a coordinated defense supported by air power and advanced communications equipment. The battle that followed became a turning point in the conflict for that region, with insurgent forces suffering devastating losses that crippled their ability to threaten local communities. Maria found herself in the unique position of providing medical care to SEAL operators, militia fighters, and even captured insurgents during the intense fighting that lasted for 3 days. Her makeshift clinic became a hub of activity, where advanced military medicine met the resourceful field techniques she had developed during her captivity. The SEALs were amazed by her ability to work effectively under fire and her innovative approaches to treating trauma injuries with limited supplies. Lieutenant Commander Jake observed Maria's work with growing respect and amazement. Here was a civilian nurse who had not only survived months of captivity and escaped through hostile territory, but had then continued to serve under combat conditions while maintaining the highest standards of medical ethics. Her treatment of wounded insurgents with the same care she provided to coalition forces exemplified the professionalism that military medical personnel strive to achieve. During a brief lull in the fighting, Jake approached Maria with an observation that would become part of SEAL unit folklore. He told her that in his years of military service, he had seen many examples of courage and dedication, but he had never witnessed anyone demonstrate such sustained heroism under impossible circumstances. Her survival story had already inspired his team, but watching her work under fire had elevated her to legendary status among the operators. The final phase of the battle came when insurgent leaders, including Commander Aziz, who had held Maria captive, launched a desperate assault on the valley to try to recapture their lost intelligence asset and eliminate the coalition presence. The attack was fierce and well coordinated, but the combined forces of SEALs, militia fighters, and air support proved overwhelming. Commander Aziz was killed in the fighting, along with most of his senior leadership, effectively ending the insurgent threat to the region. As the smoke cleared and casualty counts were compiled, the magnitude of what had been accomplished became clear. The intelligence Maria had provided and her presence during the final battle had resulted in the destruction of one of the most effective insurgent networks in Afghanistan. The villages that had lived in fear for years were finally safe, and the militia fighters could return to their families knowing their communities were secure. The formal extraction ceremony took place in the same valley where Maria had first met Captain Mahmoud's fighters months earlier. Representatives from multiple coalition nations attended to honor both her survival and her contributions to the mission. Captain Mahmoud was awarded medals for his cooperation with coalition forces, and his militia was formally recognized as an allied unit with ongoing support commitments. For Maria, the ceremony was bittersweet. She was finally going home to a family that had grieved her loss and celebrated her return, but she was also leaving behind people who had become her second family during the most challenging period of her life. The bonds forged in combat and shared hardship could never be fully replicated in the safe, comfortable world she was returning to. Lieutenant Commander Jake presented Maria with a commemorative SEAL trident, an honor rarely given to civilians. His presentation speech, later recorded in official unit histories, described her as embodying the warrior spirit that defined Special Operations Forces. He spoke of her as a legend who had shown that heroism was not limited to those who carried weapons, but could be found in anyone who, refused to surrender their humanity under the worst possible circumstances. The flight back to the United States gave Maria time to process everything that had happened since she first arrived in Afghanistan with hopes of simply helping people in need. Her journey had taken her through captivity, escape, survival, and ultimately to a form of service she had never imagined possible. The nurse who had refused to abandon her patients during an insurgent attack had become a symbol of resilience that would inspire military personnel for years to come. As the aircraft crossed into American airspace, Maria looked down at the peaceful landscape below and marveled at how different her life had become. She was returning as someone who had not only survived unimaginable hardships, but had found ways to turn those experiences into victories for the causes she believed in. The woman who had once been forgotten and left for dead had become a legend that would live on in the stories told by the SEALs who witnessed her final stand.